If you ask someone what dish reminds them of Japan, they are likely to say ramen, and then they are likely to say sushi. The delectable raw fish and vinegared rice dish is one some would consider the most Japanese thing that they've ever eaten, and ironically, they'd be so wrong. Salmon sushi, as many of you probably don't know, is not Japanese. It's actually Norwegian. Yes, you've been living a lie. Your favorite seafood dish isn't even Japanese at all. In fact, it was rejected by the Japanese originally, and only after a major rebranding campaign did it become popular there. Stick to the end of the video to find out how it all happened, as we talk about how salmon sushi became the world-class dish it is today, and what role Norway played in all of this. More of that in a second. Now before we get started, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Also, watch till the end of the video so you don't miss anything. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Japan had always been a lover of seafood, from tuna to poisonous blowfish. The Japanese included fish in anything they could. Their favourite fish was the tuna. Tuna caught in the waters of the Pacific Ocean, it was soft and had good fat concentrations, and most importantly, tasted really good. It was the main fish used when it came to raw seafood, and was viewed as a high-end type of meat, used for premium dishes. The most premium dish being sushi. Salmon, which most of you are very familiar with when it comes to sushi, wasn't used by the Japanese for a bunch of reasons. You see, salmon found around the waters surrounding Japan wasn't exactly the best that the world had to offer. It didn't taste great, was way too lean to eat raw, and most importantly had a ton of parasites. These parasites had to be taken care of before the salmon could be eaten, and the best way to do this was through heat treatment. That's just a fancy way of saying that you had to cook it thoroughly before eating, and that eating it raw as sushi was completely out of the question. Due to all of these lovely personality traits, salmon was considered pretty much bottom tier fish and was eaten mostly cured or fried. But this was all about to change. How? Let's find out. In the 1970s, Japan was a big producer of fish, with almost 7 million tons being produced annually. Interestingly, it was also a big consumer, one of the biggest to be honest, with average consumption annually being 60 kilograms per capita, 4 times the 15 kilograms per capita the rest of the world averaged around. This golden age of fish production didn't last very long for Japan, however, and after a series of misfortunes, Japan was left with fish production that couldn't even fulfill its own need, much less be exported to the rest of the world. The main reasons for this radical change was that the fishing industry had overfished, and Japan had been doing this for several decades now, and it was finally catching up to them. Also, it didn't help that the country had been thrown out of other countries' fishing zones. With less fish and even less areas to fish them in, Japan's fish production took a huge nosedive. Japan went from a country with so much surplus supply of fish that it regularly sold it to other countries, to not even being able to satisfy 50% of its own seafood needs. It was time to look at other countries for seafood, and luckily Norway happened to be at the right place at the right time. Now, while Japan's fish production had been tanking, Norway had been experiencing record highs. This is because of a newly developed technology which allowed Norwegian fish farmers to breed salmon in net pens. This salmon was not only completely parasite-free, but since they could also control its diet, it had a much higher fat content than the one that was caught in the wild. These new practices scaled up salmon production so much that Norway actually ended up with surplus salmon. It had literal tons of salmon that it needed to sell, but no one to sell it to. The Japan project was led by Thor Lissau, who was a member of the Norwegian Parliamentary Shipping and Fisheries Committee. It aimed to somehow convince the Japanese market that Norwegian fish was the right choice for them and that they needed to get their hands on it ASAP. Norway has recognized that Japan was the answer to its surplus fish problem, and that they could capitalize on the ever-increasing need for seafood in Japan by exporting their surplus and making easy profit. Thor Listau first became inspired with the idea of selling Norwegian fish to the Japanese following a trade delegation visit to Japan in 1974. The seed for this idea was planted in 1974, and in 1985 he decided to bring it to life. Listau went back to Japan in 1985 with a trade delegation of 20 members representing Norwegian seafood exporters, ministers and organizations. These people were treated to various seafood dishes, and one of these was the Norwegian salmon sushi. Norwegian salmon sushi was a first for everyone, and luckily it was a love at first sight, or in this case, first taste. Most of the delegates had never had raw fish, because it was illegal to serve raw fish in Norway at the time. They were taught how to eat sushi by the Norwegian embassy in Japan, and it was an instant success. Several important and distinguished people here were won over and convinced to increase exports of salmon to Japan. The Japan project was a huge success, and Norway's fish exports to Japan started increasing. Initially, the Japan project had just planned to double Norway's fish exports to Japan, but the actual result was far better than anyone could have thought. Norway's fish exports to Japan totaled around 500 million Norwegian kroner before the project. Just 6 years later, after the project began, this number rose to 1.8 million Norwegian kroner. The project was a booming success, and Japan went from importing not a single piece of fish in 1971 to more than 28,000 metric tons of it in 1995. With the right idea at the right time, Norway changed one of the most deeply rooted Japanese culinary traditions. Salmon, which was previously thought to be the most bottom tier fish out there, went on to being a staple in high-end sushi. This change wasn't an overnight success, however. Project Japan took over a decade right of investments, failures, and detailed sale analysis before it became the success that we know today. Norwegian salmon was first flat out rejected by Japanese consumers. They just simply couldn't wrap their minds around it being a good choice for something as traditional as sushi. Think of it as someone telling you to replace beef burgers with fish instead of beef. Sounds preposterous, doesn't it? Well, it did to the Japanese. To make it seem more normal to have salmon in sushi, the Norwegian government tried everything. Ad campaigns, full-length commercials, front-page advertisements, nothing worked. And then they had the idea to use celebrity influencers. If people saw that someone they looked up to thought it was okay to eat salmon and sushi, they would follow suit. TV chef Yutaka Ishinabe, also known as the Iron Chef, was chosen for this advertising campaign. Yutaka Ishinabe was a household name among the Japanese. Think of him as the Gordon Ramsay of Japan. Yutaka Ishinabe started speaking about how Norwegian salmon was the future of sushi, and a much better contender than the traditional tuna that everyone was used to. What really sealed its fate, however, was the deal with Nishirai. Nishirai was a popular supermarket chain that sold frozen goods. The Norwegians had been trying to strike a deal with Nishirai for quite some time, until they finally agreed. It was decided that to start, only 5,000 tons of salmon would be put on the shelves. If it worked, it worked. If it didn't, well, then Norway lost quite a bit of money in a bad investment. Luckily for them, it worked, and salmon in sushi started becoming more and more common. The public perception that salmon was a good side to be used in sushi was slowly becoming the norm, and once it became freely available specifically for sushi in one of the biggest supermarket chains of the country, consumers just went wild. Norwegian salmon was a huge hit, and although it was at first issued only in the cheaper conveyor belt sushi restaurants, chefs started slowly seeing just how good it was. Chefs noted that it had a creamy texture and almost buttery mild flavour that paired well with the vinegared rice in sushi. This discovery helped Norwegian salmon rise to the top of the ranks until it finally dethroned tuna and became the #1 sushi side dish in Japan. As time progressed, the demand for Norwegian salmon only rose, and now Norway was ready to take on the world. Before we move on to how Norway is winning over the rest of the world with its salmon exports, let's take a look at some of the factors that made the Japan project such a success. Number 1. Population increase. Call it luck, but right around the time that Norway started introducing its fish into the Japanese market, Japan started seeing a boom in its population. The population of Japan increased from 93 million to 122 million from 1960 to 1995. Such a drastic increase in population meant an increase in demand for food, and since salmon was being adopted as a staple in Japanese cuisine during this time, Norwegian fish traders fully benefited from this situation. Number 2. Having the right investment at the right time. In the business world, it's all about making the right move at the right time. Thor Listau recognized the potential the Japanese market held and decided to go all in. The Norwegian government, seafood industry, and related organizations spent a total of 30 million Norwegian kroner towards Project Japan. These investments and efforts also included a promotional visit by the Norwegian Crown Prince and Princess. Seeing the Prince and Princess dine eating salmon increased the credibility of the fish, and its reputation rose from being used only in the poorest dishes to something that the elite dined on. Number 3, an increase in per capita consumption. The Japanese were already huge fans of seafood, but after the addition of salmon in their diet, they decided it was time to go all out and started consuming it even more. In fact, per capita consumption rose to 73 kilograms per capita, and even more in some areas. Norway also benefited significantly from the fact that most of this increased consumption was specific to Norwegian seafood products. You see, the image that Norwegian salmon was the greatest thing in the world was actually really bad for the already struggling Japanese fish production industry. The industry simply couldn't compete when it came to salmon, since their salmon was of a completely different quality that no one wanted, and increased salmon sales inadvertently meant lower tuna sales, since that's what salmon itself was replacing. Before the arrival of salmon, tuna was seen as a super high-end and the best tasting sushi, but afterwards its popularity lowered significantly. This was a strong blow to the Japanese fishing industry, since tuna was actually their main product, and a decrease in the sales of something they thought was a staple was something that they had never even thought of. The failing Japanese fishing industry, combined with the ever-increasing demand for salmon, paved the way for the future in which Norway reigned supreme. Seeing that the 30 million Norwegian kroner that was poured into the project led to more than a 250% increase in exports, I say it was worth it, wouldn't you? World domination has never been this easy, and cultural, linguistical, and geographical barriers have always prevented ideas that flourished in one part of the world from making it big in other areas. The same, however, cannot be said for Norwegian salmon. With its popularity at an all-time high in Japan during the 80s and 90s, salmon sushi was becoming more and more common. This was also the golden age for Japanese films and the Japanese economy in general. This wave of Japanese world dominance among the hip, groovy, and even business class was piggybacked by the Norwegian salmon suppliers. They rode the popularity waves to the end of the world. Everywhere the Japanese went, Norwegian salmon sushi followed. Fish suppliers saw just how much potential salmon sushi had due to its high margin for profits and perceived premium quality, and started marketing it everywhere. This also helped sushi spread all around the world, and with it, Norwegian fish exports. Today, Norwegian farmed salmon is used all over the world, and Norway is the world's leading country when it comes to salmon farming. And as of this video, exports to more than 150 countries, an estimated 1 million metric tons of salmon every year. Interestingly, this is still not enough to fulfill the ever-increasing demand for salmon that has developed over the years thanks to Japan Project's right decisions at the right time. Nowadays, however, Norway has started to shift its attention to the Chinese seafood market. China has one of the largest populations in the world, and as a result, if not one of the highest demands for seafood. Salmon demand increases by 30% annually in China, and consumption is expected to rise from 55,000 tons in 2013 to between 300,000 to 400,000 tons by 2021. Of which more than 80% will be consumed as raw fish. Norwegian farmers are more than happy to fill this demand, however they have been upscaling their production units almost continuously since the 90s. China has now become the biggest importer of Norwegian seafood in the world, and the demand is only expected to rise in the future. Since you stuck around for so long, here's some bonus facts about sushi. Number 1, America, while not exactly being the biggest consumer of seafood, is still a pretty big name in the market, and in recent years has also started to shift towards sushi. Right now you can find sushi pretty much all over America, but it wasn't always like this. Americans were pretty squeamish when raw fish was introduced, and they weren't really huge fans. It was only after the introduction of crab rolls in America did people start to actually warm up to sushi. Number 2, traditional sushi isn't made like you think it is. It involves fermenting rice by wrapping fish with it and then waiting several months. The amino acids in the fish break down and it develops a sort of pungent cheesy smell. The rice is then later removed and the fish is eaten. This dish is called namanare and was developed back in the 1930s when there was no other means of storing fish except drying and salting it. Nowadays, the rice aren't fermented like they previously were, and they just add vinegar so you get that tangy sour flavor that you're really used to. That wraps up the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks, bye.